Imagine the scene. A lone horseman pushes through a pair of swinging saloon doors, stepping into the dim interior. The piano player halts. A sudden hush falls over the room, and every eye turns toward the newcomer. This is the archetypal Wild West saloon we envision from films, a setting for grand adventures and heroic gunfights. Yet, what if I revealed that nearly every element of this depiction is inaccurate? The truth was far grimier, a more squalid existence, characterized less by dramatic confrontations and more by overwhelming, inescapable grime. Today, we're stripping away the layers of Hollywood's romanticism to uncover the shocking reality of Wild West saloons. Believe me, they were far more unsanitary than you could possibly conceive. If you appreciate delving into the true history of the Old West, please click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any future journeys into the past. Now, let's step through those doors into the authentic experience. Firstly, consider the structure itself. Cast aside notions of grand wooden edifices from the silver screen. The earliest saloons were rudimentary, temporary constructions. In nascent mining camps or railroad towns, a saloon often emerged as the initial establishment, sometimes merely a rudimentary tent, a sod house, or an improvised shack made from available scrap materials. As a settlement grew, these would be superseded by basic wooden structures, frequently featuring a false front to create an illusion of greater size, an endeavor to project stability in an unpredictable environment. Only in the most thriving communities, such as Deadwood or Tombstone, would one encounter truly elaborate saloons. However, the most immediate sensation upon entering would have been the stench. A dense, noxious concoction of stale beer, cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and heavy tobacco smoke. Each time the door opened, a fresh gust of dust and manure from the unpaved thoroughfare would waft in. The auditory landscape was also distinctive. Music was a luxury. The predominant sounds were the low murmur of conversations, punctuated by the ragged coughs of ailing men. Visually, the place was simply grimy. The floors were rough wood, typically covered with sawdust to absorb spills and tobacco spit, resulting in a perpetually damp and soiled surface. The bar itself was sticky, and the entire venue was dimly illuminated by smoky kerosene lamps. Even the well-known bat-wing doors were not for dramatic entrances, but served a practical purpose: ventilation. Secondly, these establishments were hotbeds for illness. Wild West saloons were literally dirty, transforming these crowded spaces into breeding grounds for lethal diseases. The dangers lurking within a saloon were often imperceptible and considerably more perilous than any gunfight. For the typical frontier inhabitant, bathing was a substantial and infrequent task. Water had to be manually carried and heated over a fire. In a standard household, everyone would cleanse themselves in the same small tub of water, beginning with the father and concluding with the youngest child. By the end, the water was cold and filthy. Dental hygiene was equally poor. People often used a knife to dislodge food particles from their teeth. If a tooth became infected, the local barber or blacksmith would extract it with pliers, accompanied by a shot of whiskey for pain relief. The towns themselves were similarly unsanitary. There were no sewer systems. Waste was simply discarded outside the settlement. This grime was consistently tracked into the congested saloon. Such an environment was a haven for pests like lice, flies, and cockroaches. This perfect storm of inadequate hygiene, non-existent sanitation, and vermin rendered the saloon an exceptionally efficient vector for disease transmission. Cholera could sweep through a saloon, via shared unwashed glasses. Tuberculosis spread readily in the enclosed, smoky rooms. Smallpox, another highly contagious virus, would have also proliferated rapidly. In reality, one was far more likely to succumb to a disease contracted in a saloon than to a bullet. Thirdly, the whiskey was toxic. Beyond the physical and biological squalor, another form of impurity flowed freely: the liquor itself. The whiskey consumed by cowboys rarely resembled smooth, aged bourbon. More often, it was a vile and hazardous concoction, known by epithets such as coffin varnish, tarantula juice, or rot gut. Genuine, aged whiskey was a rare indulgence. To satisfy the demand for inexpensive spirits, saloon keepers crafted ersatz beverages. The base was usually cheap, raw grain alcohol. To transform this into whiskey, they would add burnt sugar for color and a plug of chewing tobacco to impart a kick with a dose of nicotine. However, the most alarming constituents were poisonous chemicals. Recipes for counterfeit bourbon sometimes specified additives like turpentine and creosote, a wood preservative. The final product was a harsh liquid that could induce severe illness. The term rot gut was a literal description of its effects. This was not merely the work of a few unscrupulous individuals. It was a widespread practice in an industry with virtually no governmental oversight. Even the beer was often disappointing. Without refrigeration, it was served at room temperature, frequently flat and stale. And, akin to whiskey, it was occasionally adulterated with narcotics to create the illusion of greater potency. Fourthly, vice and violence differed from their cinematic portrayal. The saloon's reputation as a hotbed of vice was deserved, but the reality was considerably less glamorous than what movies depict. Firstly, the classic bar brawl, the massive anarchic free-for-all, is almost entirely a cinematic fabrication. Actual saloon violence was intermittent, personal, and far more lethal. It typically manifested as a swift, brutal, and often fatal encounter between 2 or 3 men, arising from a gambling dispute or an insult. Acknowledging this danger, many towns mandated that patrons surrender their firearms at the door. This rudimentary form of gun control ensured that most disagreements were resolved with fists rather than bullets. Gambling was the primary form of entertainment. There were reputable square dealers who cultivated a reputation for honesty, alongside itinerant card shops who preyed on newcomers with marked cards and other deceptions. The role of women is also frequently misunderstood. A distinction existed between saloon girls and prostitutes. Saloon girls were entertainers. Their duty was to sing, dance, and converse with lonely patrons to encourage them to purchase more drinks. For many women, this offered a route to financial autonomy. Prostitution was a distinct and considerably more perilous profession. Finally, not everyone received a warm welcome. Contrary to the image of a lawless free-for-all, the saloon was a highly structured environment governed by rigid, unwritten rules and explicit lines of exclusion. The saloon functioned as a social hub for the white male frontier, a place where cowboys, miners, lawmen, and outlaws might all cross paths. The distinction between a lawman and an outlaw was often surprisingly fluid. However, this melting pot had firm boundaries. A respectable woman would never set foot in a saloon. Racial exclusion was also a norm. Native Americans and Chinese immigrants were not permitted. While black men constituted a significant population in the West, they were generally barred from white-owned saloons and consequently established their own. One surprisingly excluded group was the U.S. Army soldier, as many saloon patrons harbored a natural disdain for the uniform and the authority it represented. Within the accepted demographic of patrons, behavior was governed by a strict code. Privacy was paramount. One never posed personal questions about a man's past, and a powerful custom was the obligation to purchase a round of drinks. Declining an offered drink was considered a grave insult. The romanticized saloon of Hollywood is a myth. The historical truth reveals that the real saloon was a crude, unsanitary, and foul-smelling epicenter of disease. It dispensed poisonous liquor to a select clientele, all bound by rigid social codes. This grimy reality, however, serves as a far more accurate and potent symbol of the American West than the idealized myth that has superseded it. It uncovers a world not of simplistic heroes, but of authentic individuals striving for survival in a challenging environment. What aspect of the authentic Wild West saloon surprised you most? The toxic whiskey, the pervasive diseases, or the stringent social regulations? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for viewing.